Hi, I'm Dick Dadamo. Welcome to a conversation between myself and Phil Harding. Phil Harding took a company to 800 million, public company, and he is now working with small companies and startups. My hope we can get from him what are the commonalities and things that are similar to building both companies and that size to a success. Phil, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Phil, would you start up and tell us about the big company so we have an idea what they were doing, and about a couple of small companies you're working with now?
Okay. I'll start with the big company first. Actually, I ended my official career with the big company, Amflex, a public company on NASDAQ, running around $800 and $900 million a year sales, over $1 billion market cap at one time. I was the CEO and general manager of that company from 1987 to 2008, and I was the chairman of the board from 2005 to 2011. And it was a public company, manufacturing with at one time 20,000 workers, multiple plants in China, making parts that went into smartphones. I started my career mostly in small companies. Actually, I mostly worked in turnaround and startup companies, and actually, in some cases, innovation startup companies. A number of them, for example, one was a company called EM&M, where I became general manager of a very small division making computer memories. At that point time was core memories for mid-sized computers, and actually occasional mainframes. I also worked in Remex Corporation and made paper tape readers and punches, and that was actually a turnaround situation where I took over from another CEO. I was the CEO of the turnaround in that company. I had startups. I had a startup called WellTech, where we made floppy disk drives. That was the startup manufacturing before I ventured into Amflex.
Now tell us about the small companies you're associated with.
Well, the last one was WellTech, and this company actually started in the USA with a floppy disk drive concept that had double the density of what was prevalent at that time. Startup manufacturing was in Singapore, and prototypes built in California. The hope was to have a product that had twice as much capacity as the then prevalent floppy disk drives. It was for the small companies, computer companies that were running around at that time. The Remex Corporation product was point of sale, was actually not point of sale, it was a paper tape readers and punches for application machine tool industry.
Phil, that goes way back.
Yes.
But now you're working with a couple new companies. They're small startup. Tell us about their products.
Right now I'm working with two companies. One is a turnaround company that repairs airplane parts, mostly environmental control system parts, and it strictly sells to small regional airplane manufacturers around the country, in some cases overseas, repairing the parts and returning them. The second company is a startup medical operation in healthcare industry, where it's trying to detect bacteria and indicate the bacteria before problems occur.
Now, Phil, you took the company way up. There must have been a lot of entrepreneurial type things and risks to go that big. Can you tell us about some of that?
Well, Amflex was strictly a turnaround situation. When I joined Amflex, the revenue was $600,000 a year revenue, and the payroll was larger than the revenue. It took a lot of things to be done as an entrepreneur, actually, because we grew from this $600,000 of revenue to the time I retired as the CEO, but remained as chairman, to over $800 million a year. Had to make many changes and took many risks. For example, building plants before filling the plants is a major risk that you have to take. Or even investing in capital equipment. Of course, cash is a problem in a small startup company or in a company that's a turnaround company. Having sufficient cash to invest to make a change is always a big risk. So I had to do that many times in that company.
Now, I know from history that you were one of the early companies to start an operation in China. And I know at that time you were the guy. Your staff wasn't that big. So tell us about a couple experiences that must have been pretty amusing and fun and difficult.
Yeah. Well, we were the first U.S. company in our field that went to China to start a plant. And of course, this took a major effort on my part because I was in China before that with the company called Electronic Memories and Magnetics, but was really not aware of what went on in China. We looked to start an operation and to find where to put the operation and who to partner with and whether we partner with somebody was a major, major challenge for me. I went around the country first sizing up the areas where we might go, traveled all over China, and finally settled in to Suzhou, which is outside of Shanghai. Took us a while to make that decision, but we made that decision. The second decision was, should we go alone or partner? I mean, China was a very difficult, unknown situation for us because what is the culture requirements? What are the legal requirements? It's easy to want to partner with somebody, and we look for partners, but I never found a partner that I would trust. So we finally decided to go alone in Suzhou as a total startup in a new factory, hiring people. We hired 12 people and actually brought many of them to the USA to train, or we sent people there to train. And it was a cold turkey startup with nothing. We actually didn't purchase, but we rented a place initially, which we eventually purchased. There was bare walls, so we had to make leasehold improvements, starting with putting in power and electricity and water and all that kind of stuff. It took us over a year to get the power lines and water into the plant through the regulatory situation we had there. That was a very difficult task, yes.
So there was no infrastructure for help from tools and, like you say, utilities. All right, so the topic I want to get around to. Can you identify, because you had multiple experiences, small, big startups, can you have some of the similar characteristics that you find in making them successful?
Yeah. Well, in every case, planning is a very, very vital consideration. And part of planning, in the case of a small company, risk-taking is everything. I mean, you're starting with nothing. Everything's changed. Every day is a new environment for a startup, small company. So every time there's a change, which any growth is a change, there's a huge risk. Companies change. So a startup company or a turnaround company gets involved with this risk-taking, risk assessment daily. A larger company has a similar problem, but not as frequent, not as substantial. It's not a daily thing. But if you don't plan the risk for a large company and don't think about how change is needed to grow the large company, one of the worst things that can happen is don't plan the risk, and no risk is the worst risk of all. You can then go down. You can see this evidence in many large companies. If they didn't plan the change, they go down. The change is downward. That's similarity between a large company and a small company. Planning the risk that you need to take, the strategy of that risk is important. Along with that strategy is the fact that the risk you're taking may not work. You may have to deviate from your plan. One of the major problems in a large company is setting up a plan and sticking with it when it's failing. Smaller companies, fortunately or unfortunately, usually don't have the resources or the cash to continue an operation that's not working, so they're quicker to change. And one of the big differences between a large company and a small company is the small company usually is cash deficient, whereas a large company usually has more cash to spend. In that sense, a large company can afford to elongate the risk, but in many cases they elongate too much.
Phil, you made a point earlier too about the presence. At your point in time, the company must have been like a brand, whereas a small company is fighting to be recognized by everybody. So that had to be pretty good for you, because I'm sure every major quotation came to you guys to review.
Well, it didn't start that way. I mean, we started as a turnaround company where you said it, and that's a key point. One of the key challenges in marketing is to get to be one of the 2, 3, maybe as much as 5 companies that customers consider when they're considering buying. If you're not in the list of who they consider, you never get the business. So being considered for business is essential in marketing. In a small company, how do you get on that list? Mflex was not on the list when I started with the company. It took quite a while to get to be known so that we would get the quotes. This was one of the major things I had to do, is get to be recognized as a substantial supplier to large companies.
Okay, now you had, let's say, and we talked about this before you came on, is that there was a lot of pressure being the CEO of a public company from the board of directors and the shareholders, where you had probably hundreds of thousands of those. There's a lot of pressure from the startup, from the investors. Do you think those kind of pressures were similar?
Some are similar, but really there's a large difference. The small investors usually want to know when their return on investment is going to occur. They put in some cases retirement money in. For example, in Mflex, retirement money was the substantial investment by medical doctors, and when are they going to get that money back for their retirement is a key issue. So that's a constant conversation. With public companies, the conversation is usually stock price. When can the stock price go up high enough so that they can sell? That is not necessarily the same. There are similarities because, of course, if you make a lot of profit and grow, return on investment is quick. And similarly, if you make a lot of profit and grow, stock price goes up. In that sense, it's the same, but return on investment is more urgent, in a sense more urgent for the small investors, but requires more patience. A small investor will want to know when he's going to get his money back, but is not expecting the money back next quarter. In a public company, the large investors there quickly want to get returns, so they're interested in the speed of a return, not the length of the return.
Phil, can you talk about scaling in both these type of companies? Because that's something you did very good with at the company you mentioned. So, I mean, scaling is still a problem, and maybe it relates to the risk and planning you talked to. Yeah. But please elaborate on that a little bit, because that's what the small companies are really faced with, how to scale this thing.
Well, a small company obviously has a more difficult task because they usually don't have the cash. So scaling has to be planned just right. Do you put the investment into scale before you have the orders, or do you put the investment into scale after you have the orders and then run the risk of failing to make the deliveries? Or can you actually get the orders even to start with to satisfy the large potential customer if you don't show the ability to scale? So the small company is always struggling with that problem. Insufficient cash, and how do you prove to the customers you can satisfy their demand without having the presence of the factory to do it. Large companies have a little bit more tolerance because they usually have the cash and the presence and recognition by the customer. So sometimes large companies will not have a problem receiving an order from a customer. But on the other hand, sometimes large companies, because they have the cash reserves or the ability to borrow, will scale too soon before they have the business, and sometimes the business doesn't occur, and large companies fail sometimes because they scale too soon. So they both have scaling issues, but a little bit of different twists. The small company not having the funds to scale, the large company sometimes scaling too soon.
So you're talking about planning, very important even for a small company. You're talking about being able to take risk, and you're talking about raising enough money so you can really do things you want. Now, you took this company from a few $100,000 to multi-hundred millions, okay? You kind of built that, you and your staff, your vision for growth in the company. Now you go into a couple of these small companies to help. What do you look for? Because, you know, their culture is obviously different than what you've just been used to. So what do you look for, and how do you help them?
Well, there's generally three questions I ask, not necessarily in the order I'm about to answer to you. One is, does the staff, and particularly the CEO, have the passion? I mean, what's the desire? What's their wish? What do they want to do? What's the compelling problem they're solving? That's important to know. Second thing is marketing deficiency. Usually small companies are product or idea generated companies, meaning the initiators, the founders of the company have some concept that they think is going to be a big winner, and they think of the concept and they totally ignore the marketing activity that goes with that concept. So the second point is, how have they handled marketing? What is their marketing solution? Do they know their customers? Do they know how to get to the customers? Do they even have the ability to call the customers? That's a key issue. And the third one for a small company is a very important issue. What's liquidity? What's your plan long term? What you're going to invest in this company? It's going to grow, and then what? What are you going to do? You're going to retire with the company? You're going to hand it to your children? You're going to sell the company? You want to go public? What are you doing? What's the long-term purpose? Those are the three issues that I ask questions about and try to get answers before I make an investment or get involved with the small company.
Now, are you at a point where you may turn down a company because you don't like what you hear?
Oh, of course. I made 2 investments so far. In both cases, I also decide when I make an investment company, I have to be involved. I don't make passive investments. A passive investment where you stand back and just wait for the return to come in is not my way of doing things. I make an investment at the same time get involved, either be on the board or do something with my one company. I'm the chairman of the board, for example. The other company, I'm on the advisory board. In fact, I'm part of the technology impetus in the company. I will do that.
Okay, so you're very comfortable working with small companies.
I'm more comfortable working with small companies than large companies because my background, except for my success at Enflix, was mostly small companies.
Okay, and this is kind of a tough question, but so what do you think you're able to help these small companies from what you learned and taking that other public company so big?
What I learned from that?
Yeah. It helps the small companies.
Yeah. The marketing and the planning. I mean, the concept of taking risk, planning it, and actively risk-taking is a science. It's not just a guessing game. You need to be able to assess the risk you're taking and determine how it's worth it. And 2, what if the risk doesn't work? The risk you're taking, mitigating the risk at the same time taking the risk. Mitigating risk only is a bad thing, because if you only think about mitigating risks, you don't take a risk. The best mitigation is not taking a risk. So if you think solely of mitigating, you don't grow. On the other hand, if you take risk without thinking of the mitigations, you can fail. So that duality of risk-taking and mitigating, or as I say, what if the risk doesn't work? What do you do? What's a contingency plan? Those two are the key for small companies.
Phil, I like one thing you said. Look, I've been on a lot of boards, okay? And many times the board members give advice. To me, advice is like motherhood. Your G&A's too big. What's that mean? To me, counseling is advice within the resources in the system. So you're willing, when you're going to help these companies, to actually be a part of it. So I think that's a great way to go. Would you like to add anything before we wrap this up?
The summary of what I've been saying all along is really theater of the pants operation for a company, small or large, really doesn't work. And not sizing up changes is a terrible non-action that a company can take. One of the worst risks that a company can take is not taking a risk. You see this in large companies and small companies. The first company that made the appropriate change to an industry took off. And the company that was incumbent and didn't take that risk started failing. You can see that in many of the large companies around that were top of the heap, and then suddenly they're downsizing and they're failing. They did not make the appropriate change at the time. I think change is the one key element for our industry and our society.
Phil, I'd like to make that point stronger from what you told me. When you first got in this company, there were several American companies that were able to do printed circuit and printed circuit assemblies. And when you left, there were none. Is that true?
Pretty much, yeah.
So they didn't take the risk that you thought was needed, no matter what their size was. Very good point. All right, I want to thank you for your time. And again, maybe we'll find another topic to go by. If you want to hear other interviews, particularly one with Phil, please go to richarddadamo.com. And you can go to amazon.com for my latest book, The Anatomy of a Growing Company. For now, I'd like to say goodbye, but please look for all the other interviews that are now available on that website.